Hey guys, it's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living in Your Aquariums. So, today we are going to be talking about the cleanup crew you have, or the cleanup crew you think you have. So, if you've watched a lot of videos out there for beginning level aquarists, maybe you've been in the hobby a long time and you've just kind of gone with the flow and things are working. I mean, maybe you have a cleanup crew, you've got some snails, some shrimp, some plecos or catfish, and things are going okay. But do you really know which animals clean what, and what types of algae which animals eat, and which type of waste they clean up, which plants they'll eat and won't eat, and which ones can reproduce in your tank even? Well, all of these things come into play, and I've got a longer version of this video, which you can find linked at the end of the video or in the link below in the description. Today, we're going to go over a quick down and dirty version of this, and basically, I'm sad to inform you that most people I talk to, their cleanup crew, quote unquote, or those creatures that I just listed, they're not doing what you think they are. And that's because we're feeding them the wrong things. We are not paying attention to the things that they would be eating in the wild, and we're feeding them basically luxury food that they become accustomed to, and they no longer do their job. Now, there are a handful of tips and tricks that I'm going to give you in this video, and this is, like I said, a shortened version, kind of new for me. I'm usually a talker, but this is going to be a shorter version with some of those tips and tricks and the basic theme of this video, and then you can check out the longer version if you want to know literally all the basics, over 10 species of different cleanup crews I have in different tanks, and what it is they eat, don't eat, how to take care of them, and so forth. So, let's jump right in and talk about why your cleanup crew probably isn't doing the cleaning up you think they are. Alright guys, so here we are looking at a typical aquarium, Planet Aquarium setup, and we're going to be talking about the cleanup crew that's here. Now, when you talk about cleanup crews, there's kind of three situations. The first is going to be a community tank where you have fish that are kind of the star of the show. Your fish that are in the middle, that are in the daytime, the ones that are schooling, maybe you have a big angelfish or a big this or that. But whatever they are, in here I've got gouramis and tetras and pencilfish and a few endlers. Those are moving around, and I feed them a mix that they all can eat. And so this is a community situation. Then my cleanup crew is going to be, in this case, I've got Ramshorn Snails, I've got Algae Eaters, because under this intense light, we get lots of algae forming. And then I also have Plecos, but the Plecos are actually more of just a star creature in this case, because you need to know what each Pleco can do, what they eat, when they're awake, when they're asleep, all these things. Right now it's early in the morning, nighttime still essentially. And just to point out, I've got leopard frog plecos, which if you didn't do your research, you may think, okay, that's going to eat algae, it's sucking on the glass. Well, they're actually predominantly a carnivore. So these ones actually need meat. And so the fact that I am not trying to feed my cleanup crew, in a community situation, you want your cleanup crew not to be intentionally fed if you can help it. You want to try to balance. You want to walk a tightrope and not feed your cleanup crew. So in here we've got Corys, and they're going to be cleaning up the food that drifts towards the bottom. And the Plecos will do that too. They'll also eat anything that's meaty, and they'll eat a little bit of algae. Now, this kind of Pleco here, the lemon Pleco, it's going to eat any of the biofilm on the glass. It's going to eat the wood, anything on wood or stone or broad leaves. So anything that's made like algae, biofilm, bacteria from the lights is what it's going to eat. And then the nutrients in the water column is going to determine how much of that grows, how fast the plants grow, and the same with the substrate. So you definitely need to know what you're trying to accomplish with your tank, what your elements are to balance as far as what's causing nitrates, nitrites, and your ammonia cycle, all that kind of stuff, your nitrate, nitrite, your nitrogen cycle, obviously, as it's known. Now, the second situation where you may have these creatures is also kind of happening in this tank, and that's when they are a featured animal. So cleanup crew and a featured animal, that may mean that maybe they're not always doing cleanup duty. Now, in this case, we've got these little lemon plecos, and they're hanging out here. They've had babies in here too, so their babies are hanging out. And if you take a look, the babies are actually cleaning the leaves in here. And everybody's doing their part. You can see up here the catfish, even though the Cory cat, even though it's not time to be fed, they ate a while back, it's still just scrounging for food. And they're a nocturnal species, so they're going to come out at night. Now, the plecos also tend to be nocturnal. Many catfish, petricolas, things like that you may have to clean up excess food, they're also going to follow that same pattern. And because of that, you should have the food that you feed, and you want to feed it in layers. If you're in this first instance, which is community tank with your cleanup crew, you basically don't want to feed your cleanup crew anything special. You want the special things that they need in their diet to exist in your ecosystem. And if you do happen to run out of those things, so say they've cleaned all the algae, what can happen is, so here we actually have a Siamese Algae Eater that's in here, and he's actually a big adult 6-inch long one, so I'm sure he'll make an appearance in a moment, but he nibbles a little rough, and sometimes he will chew up delicate leaves. So then there is a hole in the leaves, and soon after that hole gets made, then snails will come in and they will eat that damaged leaf that's going to die anyways. So other than a few snails, so apple snails and mystery snails, your snails aren't supposed to eat your plants, and they won't unless they're completely desperate, starving to death for months. So basically, snails, you almost never need to worry about feeding any sort of Ramshorn snail, Malaysian Trumpet snail, or basically any of the snails that get into your aquarium sort of accidentally, the pest or nuisance snails. They're a great part of your cleanup crew, but just don't cater to them or they will explode. So if you keep feeding them, what can happen is you can get a situation, or if you have or you don't have a cleanup crew that eats, for instance, this kind of hair algae. We've got snails down here, and there's just too many snails because there's too much leftover food. They're not eating any of the algae that I had hoped for them to eat. And so that means I need to scale back on the amount of food that's in this aquarium because they're reproducing. So if your snails start reproducing heavily, you know you're feeding your fish way too much. You can cut way back. In this aquarium, it's a little hard because I have to feed a certain amount to keep the nutrients and nitrates and the biological mass in the tank up, because I'm keeping these little gobies. You see that little goby there in the crack? And it eats biofilm that's on hard surfaces and the broad leaves as well. Now, the Nerite snail is the only creature in this tank that's going to eat the diatom algae, or the hard, crusty algae that grows on the glass. And it's important to know these things. If that's an issue for you, then you need some Nerite snails. They will not reproduce in this tank, and they're the only cleanup crew member that will not reproduce, assuming that they had both genders. Now, we've also got otocinctlus in here, and they're going to eat the soft algae in between things, the algae that can grow like right up in here, this filamentous algae, but they won't eat that coarser hair algae. And you can see on the glass here too, the other thing you need to make sure that your cleanup crew has to function properly is as this guy is eating, this Nerite snail is scraping that hard algae off, it has these teeth that are made out of enamel and carbonate and calcium, and basically they need to have those hard scrapers, as well as oftentimes your plecos or other fish that are eating off the glass and things like that, they also will have little teeth that are tiny, tiny teeth. And what they need to build that from is the calcium or the carbon in the water. And so your KH, GH, and dissolved solids is something you also may want to monitor. However, if you're in a situation where you've got a cleanup crew and they've run out of food and they're starting to eat things in your aquarium, obviously you could either remove some of those snails or you could start feeding the cleanup crew. Now, I would definitely remove those snails, put them in another tank or something. But the third situation that we're going to talk about, which is when you're not necessarily, because, I mean, if you've got the second situation where you have a species like this Pleco or the Corys, for instance, that are considered part of your community, you want to be feeding them, you want them to have their own food and to be well fed, then that's all fine and you can feed accordingly. But that may mean feeding at night. They're still going to eat that extra food. So maybe you want to feed in layers. You'll feed a floating flake food at the top for all the community fish and schooling fish. You get a pellet that sinks to the mid-level and to the bottoms in spots for the Corys that are willing to come up and take a nibble, and for the gouramis and maybe the cichlids that I have in here. And then you'll get wafers for the algae-eating pleco, like an algae wafer. And the thing that's key is to never feed them more than they're going to eat, just to stay fed and not eating the other elements in your tank. So just like the snails, these guys will nibble on algae a little harder sometimes on leaves, like on those anubias back there. They can tear them up, or on this sword fern, you can see it's a little torn up because they got so hungry, the cleanup crew didn't have food. That means they're doing a great job and I'm not overfeeding at all. So that's actually a really good thing to see, even though it's a precarious balance. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, the third situation we'll have to go into the other room and take a look at, but that's when you are raising cleanup crew on their own as the species in your tank. So maybe that's a shrimp colony, maybe that's snails, maybe you're breeding mystery snails or something, or just some sort of oddball catfish, petricolas or something. If you're breeding those on their own, then you need to have special food for them. And there's all sorts of things out there, and you need to really do your research and find out what they are. Just like if you got this guy, assuming he would clean all your glass, and you find out he can't eat the hard stuff, you need Nerite snails. Well, what are your Nerite snails going to eat if the glass is all clear? And then if in the case of Nerite snails, they won't reproduce, but you've put more algae in there for them to eat so they don't starve, and then all of a sudden all the other species of snails and your plecos, all these other things, start getting excess food, and you can also build up nitrates and nitrites. So you really have to be careful, again, whoever you're feeding. So that's why it's so important to feed at the right time. If they're nocturnal, feed right after the lights go out or right before the lights go out, and then use something like a turkey baster or something that sinks. With a turkey baster, you can get bloodworms, even live baby brine shrimp, whatever you need to feed those special creatures, you can get it all the way down to them by using the right implement or the right food source. So we're going to wrap this up by talking about what you do in the case of your cleanup crew being the star of your aquarium, and that will kind of conclude this. But if you want to know about what kind of Siamese algae eater to get, to eat what kind of, I got a black-beard algae problem, I got a green algae problem, I got a hard, dusty algae problem, whatever it may be, I cover over a dozen species in combination and what works in that video linked in the description below. But let's talk about this last situation, which is raising these guys. And this may happen sometimes if, say, your cleanup crew, like in this case, if I don't want to worry about it and I want to manually remove all those Ramshorn snails that can reproduce in here, then if I have a tank of them, what do I do with them so that it doesn't explode in population? We're going to talk about that last little bit here in just one sec. Alright guys, so the last scenario, number 3 scenario, is when you have your oddball, your cleaning crew. They are your star. Look at all these snails. So what I've done here is what happens to many people accidentally, and that is there aren't any fish. Well, there's a few fish, but there aren't a ton of fish. The fish that are here are just to eat some of the excess food. But I wanted these snails to explode because I'm trying to breed a specific line of albino pink Ramshorn snails. Now, you also want to make sure that your specialty cleanup crew has the things they need. So, depending on your water parameters, you'll need to learn about KH, GH, and TDS, total dissolved solids, things like that, because you can tell from their shells, both shrimps and snails, you can tell here that he has plenty of calcium and carbon because his shell has those little ridges on it. Now, if his shell was starting to look clear, like a tank I have over here, then we're getting to the area where you can see the snail inside, and you might be a little low on the calcium and on the KH and GH. There's things you can buy for that, water additives, like Shrimp Essentials. I mean, I don't have a brand that I'm endorsing here, but I happen to have this. But the other option you have is to feed specialty foods for your species. So learn your species, know your species, and that could be something like this snowflake, which is exactly like the high protein stuff that floats to the bottom of lakes and rivers that fish miss. You know, it's made up of dead fish and insects and things like that. Also, you might just want to feed something like crab cuisine or something like bottom feeder food. Something like Rapashi bottom scratcher that you actually make. It's like Jello. That's what you want to do. You want to tailor the diet for those specialists. So if your aquarium cannot produce that, then make sure that you are giving them what they need. And likewise, like you can see if there's enough calcium in your water because of your snails, you can also look at your shrimp and see if they're looking milky colored, foggy, white, then there's probably too much. Or if they're getting stuck in their sheds, if you see them halfway in a shed and they die, or they get a line around the center known as the line of death, that means that there's probably too much. In this tank we have just about the perfect amount, and I apologize for not being able to see through very well, but that's because we have biofilm, because yet again, type 2 tank. We have all sorts of gobies in here, and then we have a cleanup crew of shrimp, but we also have rainbow fish, which need really soft water and lots of water changes, and so we need that biofilm on the walls. So it doesn't always look the prettiest, but you need to give the food that your fish want. And here you can see we've got the gobies hiding out right there. Whoa, took off, but they need that to survive. They need the hard algae just before it forms, the biofilms, the aufwuchs as they're known, the colonies of bacteria and fungus and little teeny critters, those little white dots that jump around in your aquarium if you look really closely. That's what a lot of these guys eat. In other cases, you might need to give them live food, but all these things have waste byproducts unless they're a natural part of the ecosystem. So if I just allow light to grow this diatom, then that's fine. They can graze and eat it. But if I put a Nerite snail in here right now to try to get rid of this, which it would totally do, all of a sudden they wouldn't have food. So if you're not ready to have periods where maybe this is you're playing on a balancing game, and if you're not ready to have periods where you may need you may need excess algae, you may need excess diatomaceous algae. You may need planaria or something even, or worms in your aquarium. All that is part of deciding what species you're going to keep and how you're going to keep them. So down here we have another type 3 tank where it's not a community tank, but rather it's a tank for growing shrimp, Caridina blue dream shrimp here, and blue release shrimp. But in order to give them enough food that this colony keeps growing, what I have to do is I have to feed them enough that there is some waste. And rather than having snails growing out of control or anything, I decided to put some baby Plecos in here, some baby Ancestris in here like you see on the front, and they're helping in eating the soft green algae and the biofilm on the sides, whereas my shrimp are getting the special shrimp food that I got from Aquatic Arts, which is where also I got these guys. Now, why do I have the panda loaches in here? Well, one, I like panda loaches, but two, they're in here to eat the planaria, because planaria are a very common pest. Let's see here. But there's one right here that we can focus on, hopefully, if the glare is not helping us at all. But they are a little flatworm with a triangular head. And I knew that they would be in here if I started feeding shrimp to the point where their population would explode. And so because of that, I got the loaches in here. And these panda loaches love to eat them. But if I were to be giving the panda loaches food from the store that has a nutrition profile that's maybe more complete instinctually to them, just like humans crave sugar because it's rare, they crave the stuff that's in the store foods that are designed to feed a wide array of fish, because it has those nutrients and things that are hard to find, even if they're trace nutrients and not what they really need day in and day out. So it's all a balancing game, and it's all about knowing your critters really well. But with some research, you can do that. So thanks again for tuning in and learning with me, learning a little something. Here we've got another shrimp tank, and these guys are a type 2 tank in that I wanted these little killies, and they eat the little bugs in planaria as well. Scarlet Batis will. Even live bears will eat planaria, so you don't need to use chemicals if you've got hydra or planaria growing. You can literally just cut back on your feeding, and ta-da, one day your endlers or guppies will start deciding, oh, those taste pretty good, I don't have another option. So set your tank up the way that your species need it to be set up, both by what they like in the wild and by what food is produced, depending on light intensity, how much food you put in, how much fertilizers you put in, and also what species they are and the plants you have and how quickly they eat up the excess nutrients. All right, guys, thanks for watching. This has been The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. And if you want to tune in the future for updates, for deep dives, and for all sorts of interviews, species profiles, and just interesting stuff on a nerdy fish level, please click the little bell and hit that little thumbs up if you enjoyed yourself today. Also in the comments, if you guys are raising one of these type 3 aquariums where you've got a shrimp or a mystery snail, or maybe a farawalla or some sort of interesting little catfish that eats cleanup crew food, let me know what it is you feed them and what it is that you're keeping. I'd love to hear what little oddball critters you guys have. All right, guys, thanks for your time, and I will talk to you later. Bye.